My daughter died 4 months ago, and I thought the worst thing in my life had already happened. I buried her with my own hands, stood there watching them lower the coffin, and told myself that from that day on, my only purpose was to protect what she left behind. Her son. My grandson. That little boy was all I had left of her, and I promised myself I would never let him suffer, no matter what it cost me. So when her husband told me he was struggling, that things were harder than he expected, that raising a child alone while grieving was breaking him, I didn't question it. I didn't hesitate. Every month I sent him $30,000, believing I was helping keep my daughter's home alive, believing I was making sure my grandson had everything he needed, believing I was doing the right thing. And for a while I felt at peace with that decision. It gave me something to hold on to, something that made the pain feel less useless. I thought I was protecting my grandson from the chaos that follows loss, from the emptiness that I knew too well. I trusted his father. I trusted the man my daughter chose. Until one afternoon my phone rang, and a small, quiet voice on the other end changed everything I believed. Grief has a way of making you blind to things that should be obvious. It softens your instincts, dulls your sense of danger, and makes you cling to anything that feels like stability, even when that stability is built on lies. I didn't realize it at the time, but I wasn't just grieving my daughter. I was losing my ability to see clearly. My name is Margaret, I'm 68 years old, and I never imagined I would be telling a story like this. Not after everything I had already been through. Not after losing my only child. I thought the rest of my life would be quiet, filled with memories, maybe a little loneliness, but nothing more. I never imagined I would have to fight for my own grandson. Looking back now, the signs were there. Small things that didn't quite add up, details that I brushed aside because I didn't want to believe something was wrong. Because believing something was wrong meant accepting that I had trusted the wrong person at the worst possible time. And when that call came, I realized just how wrong I had been. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind of afternoon that feels heavier than usual when you're grieving. The house was silent, too silent, the kind of silence that reminds you of everything that's missing. I was sitting by the window, holding one of my daughter's old sweaters, something I had started doing without even thinking, just to feel close to her in some way. My phone rang, and for a moment I didn't even look at it. I had grown tired of calls filled with sympathy, with people asking how I was doing when I didn't even know how to answer that question myself. But something made me pick it up. I didn't recognize the number. It wasn't saved, and for a second I considered letting it ring. But there was a feeling in my chest, something subtle but persistent, telling me to answer. So I did. I pressed the button slowly, brought the phone to my ear, and said hello, expecting a wrong number, a telemarketer, anything ordinary. What I heard instead was silence. Not empty silence, but the kind that feels like someone is there, just not sure if they should speak. Then I heard it. Small voice. Hesitant. Almost whispering. "Grandma." My heart stopped. I hadn't heard his voice like that before. Not that quiet, not that unsure. He was usually brighter, even after everything that had happened. I sat up straight, gripping the phone tighter without realizing it, and tried to keep my voice steady as I answered him. I asked if everything was okay, if his father was around, if something had happened. But he didn't answer any of those questions right away. There was a pause, a long one, and I could hear him breathing softly, like he was afraid someone might hear him. And then he said something that didn't make sense at first. Something so simple that it took me a few seconds to understand what he really meant. "Grandma, I just wish there was milk in the fridge every day." I felt something shift inside me, something cold and sharp. I didn't react immediately. I told myself I was misunderstanding, that maybe he meant something else, that maybe it was just a child saying something random. But deep down, something in me already knew that wasn't true. Before I could say anything, he spoke again, a little faster this time, like he had been holding it in for too long. "Grandma, please stop sending money to Dad. I just want food, he doesn't buy it, he spends it. If you want to know, follow him." The line went silent again. And this time, it wasn't just silence. It was the sound of my world breaking for the second time. I didn't move for a long time after the call ended. The phone was still in my hand, pressed against my ear, even though the line had gone completely silent. I kept waiting for him to say something else, to laugh, to tell me it was a joke, that everything was fine. But nothing came. Just that silence. And the echo of his voice repeating in my mind over and over again, like something my heart refused to accept but my instincts couldn't ignore. First, I tried to rationalize it. Children say things. They misunderstand situations. Maybe he wanted attention. Maybe he missed his mother so much that he was expressing it in the only way he knew how. I told myself that grief affects children differently, that maybe he was confused, that maybe he had opened the fridge once and there was no milk at that exact moment. It didn't mean anything. Couldn't mean what it sounded like. But the more I tried to explain it away, the heavier it felt. Because it wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. That hesitation. That fear in his voice. That whisper, like he wasn't supposed to be making that call. That wasn't a child complaining. That was a child hiding something. And deep down I knew the difference. I stood up slowly and walked to the kitchen, not really knowing why. Maybe I needed something to hold on to, something normal, something that made sense. I opened my own fridge, stared at the milk sitting there, untouched, and felt a sudden wave of guilt wash over me, so strong that I had to grab the counter to steady myself. My grandson was asking for something so simple. And I had been sending more money than most people see in years, believing he had everything. That's when another thought crept in. Quieter but far more dangerous. What if he was telling the truth? I didn't want to think that. I didn't want to even consider it. Because if it was true, it meant I had been helping the wrong person. It meant I had been blindly trusting a man without ever checking what was really happening inside that house. It meant my grandson had been suffering, while I believed I was protecting him. And worst of all, it meant my daughter had left her child with someone who didn't deserve him. I sat down at the table and stared at nothing for a long time, trying to decide what to do. Calling him directly didn't feel right. If there was something wrong, he wouldn't admit it. If my grandson had called me in secret, it meant he was afraid of being heard. That alone was enough to tell me this wasn't something I could confront openly. Not yet. So I made a decision. I wouldn't ask. I would see for myself. The next morning I didn't call. I didn't warn anyone. I got in my car early before I had time to overthink what I was doing, and drove straight to their house. The entire drive felt heavier than usual, like every mile was pulling me closer to something I wasn't ready to face. Part of me hoped I would get there and find nothing wrong, that I would walk into a normal home, see my grandson smiling, and feel foolish for even doubting. But another part of me, the part one couldn't silence, was preparing for something else. When I pulled up, the house looked exactly the same. Nothing out of place. The same curtains, the same quiet front yard, the same stillness that had always been there. From the outside, it looked like nothing had changed. And for a brief moment I felt relief. Maybe this was all in my head. Maybe grief had made me paranoid. Maybe everything was fine. I knocked on the door, and after a few seconds he opened it. My son-in-law looked surprised to see me, but only for a moment. Then he smiled, stepped aside, and welcomed me in as if nothing was unusual. He hugged me, asked why I hadn't called first, said I didn't have to drive all the way without notice. His tone was calm, controlled, exactly how I had always seen him. Too normal. I asked where my grandson was, trying to keep my voice steady, and he pointed toward the living room. The boy was sitting on the couch, quiet, holding something in his hands, but he didn't look up right away. When he finally did, our eyes met for just a second. And I saw it. That same hesitation. That same fear. But this time it was clearer. Real. Not something I could dismiss. We hugged, and I held him a little longer than usual. He felt lighter. Too light. I didn't say anything. I just observed. After a few minutes, I made an excuse and walked toward the kitchen. I don't even remember what I said. Something about getting water. Something simple. But the moment I stepped inside, everything inside me went quiet. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when your body realizes something before your mind does. I walked to the fridge, opened it slowly, and just stood there. There was almost nothing inside. No milk. No proper food. Just a few random items, barely enough for a single meal. And in that moment, I didn't feel confused anymore. I felt something much worse. I felt certainty. I closed the fridge slowly, carefully, as if making any sudden movement would somehow break the fragile control I still had over myself. My hands didn't tremble, my breathing didn't change, and from the outside, I looked exactly the same. But inside, something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. That was no longer doubt. That was no longer suspicion. That was confirmation. My grandson hadn't exaggerated. He hadn't misunderstood. He had told me the truth. And I had almost ignored it. I turned around and walked back into the living room, forcing myself to remain calm, to observe instead of react. My son-in-law was sitting there, relaxed, scrolling through his phone as if everything in his life was under control. There was no urgency in him, no sign of struggle, no visible weight of responsibility. And for the first time since my daughter died, I looked at him not as family, but as a man I didn't truly know. My grandson was quiet beside him, sitting in a way that didn't belong to a child his age. There was no restlessness, no curiosity, no energy. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes from learning too early that speaking doesn't change anything. When our eyes met again, he didn't say a word. But he didn't have to. That look was enough. It said everything his voice couldn't say out loud in that house. I sat down across from them and started asking simple questions. Nothing that would raise suspicion. I asked about school, about routine, about meals, about how things had been since I last visited. He answered everything smoothly, almost too smoothly. He talked about how hard things were, how he was doing his best, how he was trying to keep things normal for the child. Sounded perfect, rehearsed. And if I hadn't seen that fridge, I might have believed every word. But now every answer felt wrong. Every sentence sounded like something built to hide something else. I stayed a little longer, long enough to watch, long enough to confirm what I already knew without exposing myself. And when I finally stood up to leave, I hugged my grandson again. This time I leaned closer and whispered softly, so only he could hear me. "I'm here." He didn't respond, but I felt his small hands hold onto me just a little tighter. And that was all I needed. Because as I walked out of that house, I made a decision I never thought I would have to make. I was done trusting him. From that moment on, I was going to find out everything. The moment I got home, I didn't sit down, I didn't rest, and I didn't allow myself to cry. That surprised me the most. I thought I would break the second I closed the door, but instead something else took over. A different kind of energy. Cold, focused, almost unfamiliar. The kind of clarity that only comes when denial is no longer an option. For the first time in 4 months, I wasn't grieving. I was thinking. I replayed everything in my mind. Call. His voice. The fridge. The way my grandson looked at me without speaking. The way his father answered every question without hesitation. It all fit together now. Like pieces of something I had refused to assemble before. And the more I thought about it, the more one realization settled in. If my grandson had asked me to follow him, then he already knew something I didn't. That thought stayed with me. Because children don't say things like that without reason. I walked to my desk, opened my bank app, and stared at the transactions. Month after month, the same amount. $30,000. Sent without question. Sent with trust. Sent with the belief that I was protecting my daughter's child. And now, all I could see was how easy it had been. How quickly I had acted. How little I had verified. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me too. About how grief had made me vulnerable. But guilt doesn't fix anything. Action does. So instead of confronting him, instead of asking questions that would only alert him, I made a decision that felt uncomfortable, but necessary. I would stop being predictable. I wouldn't send the next transfer right away. Not yet. I wanted to see what happened when the flow of money wasn't guaranteed. I wanted to see if pressure would reveal something he had been hiding. And more than that, I wanted to see him when he thought no one was watching. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I didn't call. I didn't send a message. I got dressed quietly, got into my car, and drove to a place where I could see his house without being seen. Felt wrong. It felt like something I shouldn't be doing. But every time doubt tried to creep in, I remembered my grandson's voice asking for milk. That was enough to keep me there. I waited. Minutes turned into an hour, and just when I started wondering if I was making a mistake, the front door opened. He stepped out dressed well, far better than someone who claimed to be struggling. Clean clothes, confident posture, no sign of stress. He looked like a man going somewhere he wanted to be. Not someone overwhelmed with responsibility. And that was the moment I understood something even deeper. This wasn't neglect. This was a choice. I watched as he got into his car and drove off, not once looking back at the house where his child was still inside. I waited a few seconds, just enough to keep distance. And then I followed him. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, not from fear, but from certainty. Because deep down I already knew. Whatever I was about to see would change everything. I kept a safe distance as I followed him, careful not to get too close, careful not to be noticed. My heart wasn't racing the way I expected. It was steady, cold, focused, like my body already understood that this wasn't about fear anymore. It was about truth. Every turn he made I followed. Every stoplight, every street, every movement felt like it was leading me toward something I had already accepted but still needed to see with my own eyes. After about 20 minutes, he slowed down and turned into a place that immediately felt wrong. Not unfamiliar, but wrong for the situation he had described to me so many times. It wasn't a grocery store. It wasn't a school. It wasn't anywhere a struggling father would prioritize. It was a high-end restaurant, the kind of place people go to celebrate, to indulge, to spend money without thinking twice. And as I watched him park without hesitation, something inside me tightened. I parked across the street, far enough to stay unnoticed, and sat there for a moment, staring at the entrance. I told myself there could be an explanation. Meeting. Friend. Something temporary. Something that still made sense. But deep down, I already knew that wasn't the truth. Because nothing about this felt accidental. Then I saw her. She was already standing near the entrance, dressed elegantly, smiling the moment she saw him. Not the kind of smile you give a friend. Not the kind you give someone you barely know. It was familiar, intimate, comfortable. And when he walked up to her, he didn't hesitate. He leaned in, kissed her on the cheek, and then held her in a way that made everything clear without a single word being spoken. I felt it then. Not confusion, not doubt, rage. But it wasn't loud. Didn't explode. It sat quietly inside my chest, growing heavier with every second I watched them walk inside together, like nothing in their lives was broken, like nothing was missing, like there wasn't a child sitting in a house somewhere, wondering if there would be food that day. I stepped out of the car slowly and crossed the street, my movements controlled, deliberate. I wasn't thinking anymore. I was witnessing. I walked toward the restaurant and stopped just short of the entrance, positioning myself where I could see inside without being seen. And there they were, seated at a table near the window, laughing. Relaxed. Comfortable. Like this wasn't new. Like this was normal. A waiter approached them, and within minutes, the table began to fill. Drinks, expensive ones. Food that no one struggling would ever justify ordering. I watched him gesture casually, confidently, like money wasn't a concern. Like he had plenty. Like the thousands I had been sending every month were nothing more than fuel for this life he was building for himself. And in that moment, one image forced its way into my mind. An empty fridge. No milk. A quiet child asking for something so basic. While his father sat there spending money like it meant nothing. That was the moment something inside me changed permanently. Not just how I saw him, but how I saw myself. Because I wasn't just a victim of his deception. I had been the one funding it. I didn't go inside that restaurant. I didn't confront him. I didn't make a scene. For a moment the thought crossed my mind, strong and immediate, to walk in there and expose everything right then, to let him see that I knew, to break that comfortable illusion he was sitting in. But I didn't move. Because something deeper told me that reacting in that moment wouldn't fix anything. It would only warn him. And I didn't want him warned. I turned around slowly, walked back to my car, and sat there without starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, but I wasn't seeing the street in front of me anymore. All I could see was my grandson's face. And that empty fridge. The contrast was unbearable. One side of his life filled with excess, comfort and lies. The other side, quiet hunger, silence, and neglect. And the bridge between those two realities was me. That realization didn't come gently. It hit me all at once, heavy and undeniable. Every transfer I had sent, every time I had trusted without verifying, every moment I chose comfort over truth. It had all contributed to this. I wasn't just someone who had been deceived. I had unknowingly allowed it to continue. And that kind of guilt doesn't disappear. Transforms. I took a deep breath, finally started the car, and drove home without looking back. The entire way, my mind was no longer confused. There were no more questions. Only decisions. Clear, precise, necessary. I knew exactly what I had to do next. And for the first time since my daughter died, I felt something that resembled control. The first thing I did when I got home was open my bank app again. I stared at the next scheduled transfer. $30,000. For a few seconds I hesitated. Not because I doubted my decision, but because I realized how easy it had been before. How automatic, how unquestioned. That money had been my way of staying connected to my daughter, of feeling like I was still helping her somehow. Cutting it off felt like closing a door I wasn't ready to close. But then I remembered his laughter in that restaurant. And my grandson asking for milk. I canceled the transfer. Just like that. No message. No explanation. No warning. And that silence was intentional. Because now I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because my mind was working in a way it hadn't in months. I began thinking about proof, about timing, about what would happen when he realized the money wasn't coming. I knew he would reach out. I knew he would ask questions. And when he did, I needed to be ready. But more than anything, I needed to protect my grandson. Not later. Not eventually. Because the moment I saw that empty fridge, I understood something I could no longer ignore. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about a child who had no one speaking for him. And that was about to change. It didn't take long. Less than 24 hours after I canceled the transfer, my phone rang. I was sitting in the living room, the same place where I had spent countless afternoons grieving, but this time I wasn't lost in memory. I was waiting. Not nervously. Not anxiously. Just waiting, with a calmness that felt almost unnatural considering everything I now knew. His name appeared on the screen. For a second I let it ring. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted him to feel that space, that delay, that subtle shift in control. Before I would have answered immediately. Before, I was available, predictable, easy to reach. But not anymore. I let the phone ring just a little longer than necessary. And then I answered. I kept my voice steady, soft, exactly how he was used to hearing it. He didn't waste time. He asked about the transfer. Not how I was. Not how I had been coping. Not even a simple check-in. Straight to the money. The tone wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't casual either. There was something beneath it. Expectation. Pendence. Almost entitlement. And hearing that confirmed everything I had already started to understand. I apologized. I told him I had been busy, that things had been overwhelming, that I hadn't had the chance to send it yet. I spoke slowly, carefully, choosing every word with intention. I needed him relaxed. I needed him to believe that nothing had changed, that I was still the same person he had been manipulating without resistance. He softened immediately. That was the first thing I noticed. The tension in his voice disappeared almost instantly, replaced by something more familiar. Gratitude, warmth, reassurance. He told me he understood, that he knew I had a lot on my mind, that he appreciated everything I had been doing. Sounded genuine, convincing, the kind of tone that would have worked on me just days before. But now, it sounded like a performance. He started talking more, filling the silence, explaining how difficult things had been lately, how expensive everything was, how he was trying his best to keep things stable for the child. Every sentence felt carefully constructed, like he had used these words before, like he knew exactly how to position himself in a way that would trigger sympathy instead of suspicion. And I let him. I agreed with him. I reassured him. I told him I would send the money soon. Not because I planned to, but because I needed him comfortable. Because the moment he became uncomfortable, he would start hiding things better. And I wasn't done watching yet. Before ending the call, I asked one simple question. How's he doing? There was a brief pause. So short that most people wouldn't notice. But I did. He answered quickly after that, saying everything was fine, that the boy was adjusting, that things were getting better day by day. His tone was smooth, confident, almost automatic. And if I hadn't seen what I saw, I might have believed him. But now that small pause said more than his entire answer. I ended the call gently, thanked him, told him I would talk to him soon. And when the line went quiet again, I didn't feel confusion anymore. Felt control. Because now I knew something he didn't. He still thought I was blind. And that was exactly how I wanted it. 2 days later I went back. I didn't call. I didn't warn him. Just like before, I drove there quietly, with the same calm determination that had taken the place of my grief. But this time, I wasn't there to observe the house. I was there for him. My grandson. Because after everything I had seen, I knew one thing for certain. If I wanted the truth, I wouldn't get it from his father. I would get it from the one who had nothing left to hide. When I knocked on the door, he answered again, just like last time, slightly surprised but quick to recover. He smiled, stepped aside, and let me in, talking as if everything was normal, as if nothing had changed since my last visit. His tone was easy, controlled, almost rehearsed. And I played my part just as well. Smiled back. He nodded. Kept everything light. Because the moment he felt something was off, everything would close again. But this time I didn't stay long in the living room. I asked if I could take my grandson to his room for a moment. Said I had brought him something small. He didn't question it. Why would he? To him, I was still the same grandmother who trusted him, the same woman who sent money without asking questions. He waved his hand casually, barely looking up from his phone. That alone told me everything I needed to know. I walked down the hallway with my grandson beside me, and the moment we stepped into his room and closed the door, the air changed. Felt different, quieter, safer. He sat on the edge of the bed, looking at me without speaking, like he was waiting to see if it was really okay to say something. So I sat in front of him and lowered my voice. You can tell me the truth. For a moment he didn't respond. He just looked down at his hands, fidgeting slightly, like he was trying to find the right words without getting in trouble. That hesitation, that fear. It wasn't natural for a child his age. And seeing that broke something inside me in a way I wasn't prepared for. Then he spoke. Not all at once. Slowly, carefully, like someone who had learned that saying too much could have consequences. He told me that sometimes there wasn't food. Not always. But often enough that he noticed. That he learned to stay quiet when he was hungry because asking didn't change anything. He told me that his father would leave for long periods, sometimes at night, sometimes during the day, and that he was told to stay in his room or just watch something until he came back. He told me about the fridge. How sometimes it had almost nothing inside. How he started drinking water when he felt hungry because it made the feeling go away for a little while. And then, he told me something that made everything even worse. He says not to tell you because you'll worry. I felt it immediately. That tightness in my chest, that mix of anger and guilt rising at the same time, fighting for space inside me. He wasn't just neglecting him. He was controlling the narrative, keeping him quiet, making sure the truth never reached me. I reached out and held his hands gently, trying to keep my voice steady. You did the right thing calling me. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I arrived, I saw something different in his eyes. Relief. Small, quiet, but real. And that was the moment I made a promise to myself. Not just that I would fix this, but that he would never have to feel like this again. Not in that house. Not with that man. Not ever again. When I left that room, I wasn't the same person who had walked into that house. Something inside me had settled in a way that didn't leave space for hesitation anymore. The doubt was gone. The confusion was gone. Even the guilt, as heavy as it still was, had transformed into something sharper, more directed. I wasn't there to figure things out anymore. I was there to end it. I stepped back into the living room, and he was exactly where I had left him, sitting comfortably, scrolling through his phone, completely unaware of what had just changed inside that house. He looked up when I walked in, smiled casually, asked if everything was okay. And for the first time since I started seeing the truth, I looked at him without any emotional filter. I saw him clearly, not as the man my daughter married, not as family, but as someone who had taken advantage of trust, of grief, of silence, and turned it into something ugly. Smiled back. Controlled. Just like before. Because this wasn't the moment. Not yet. I stayed for a few more minutes, just enough to keep everything normal, just enough to avoid raising any suspicion. I told him I had to leave, that I would call him later, that I would take care of the transfer soon. The same words he expected. The same version of me he believed in. And he believed it. That was the last confirmation I needed. Because the moment someone underestimates you is the moment you gain control. As I walked out of the house, I didn't feel hesitation anymore. Felt urgency. Not panic, but clarity. Every second that passed was another second my grandson was in that environment, adapting to something no child should ever have to accept as normal. And I knew I couldn't wait for things to get worse. They were already bad enough. The moment I got into my car, I didn't drive home. I drove straight to the police station. Walking in there wasn't easy. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because saying it out loud made it real in a way nothing else had. Explaining that my grandson was being neglected. That money meant for him was being misused. That his own father was leaving him without basic care. Every word felt heavy, but necessary. The officer listened carefully. Professional. He asked questions. Specific ones. About frequency, about conditions, about what I had seen, what I had heard, what I could prove. And that's when I understood something important. This wasn't just about emotion. This was about evidence. So I told him everything. Call. The fridge. The restaurant. The money. The other woman. Pattern. I gave him details, timelines, anything that could help build a clear picture of what was happening. And when I finished, there was a moment of silence. Not doubt. Evaluation. He nodded slowly and told me something I will never forget. You did the right thing coming here. That was the first time since all of this started that I felt supported. But it wasn't over. Not even close. Because now, this wasn't just my fight anymore. This was about to become something much bigger. Perfect. Now comes the most tense moment in the story, where everything converges. The next morning didn't feel like a normal morning. It felt heavier, sharper, like the air itself knew something was about to happen. I barely slept the night before, not because of fear, but because my mind wouldn't stop organizing everything. Every detail, every moment, every piece of what I had seen and heard. This wasn't just about confronting him anymore. This was about making sure he couldn't deny it. The officer I had spoken to called me early. His voice was calm, steady, and direct. He told me they would accompany me, that they needed to see the conditions themselves, that what I had described was serious enough to require immediate attention. There was no hesitation in his tone, no doubt. That alone gave me the strength I didn't know I still had. We agreed on a time. And just like that, it became real. When I got into my car, I wasn't alone this time. A police vehicle followed closely behind me, not aggressively, not with sirens, but with presence. Quiet authority. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself to be felt. As we drove toward the house, I realized something that settled deep inside me. This wasn't just about what he had done. This was about what he was about to lose. We arrived without warning, just like before. But this time, I wasn't the only one at the door. I knocked, my hand steady, my expression calm. Took a few seconds and then he opened it. The moment he saw me, he smiled automatically. The same controlled, familiar smile he had used every time I showed up unexpectedly. But that smile didn't last long. Because then he saw who was standing behind me. Everything changed in his face. Not dramatically. Not in a way most people would notice. But I saw it. That small shift. That quick tightening around his eyes. That flicker of confusion. Followed by something else. Concern. Is everything okay? He asked, trying to keep his tone even. Before I could answer, one of the officers stepped forward, calm and professional, introducing himself and explaining that they needed to come inside. No accusations. No raised voices. Just facts. Procedure. But that alone was enough to break the illusion he had been living in. He hesitated. Just for a second. And that second said everything. Then he stepped aside. We walked in. The house was quiet just like before. My grandson was in the living room, sitting in the same place, holding the same quiet posture that no child should ever learn. When he saw me, his eyes lit up, not with excitement but with something deeper. Oh. The officers moved through the house methodically, observing, asking simple questions, checking the environment without rushing. And then, just like I had done days before, one of them walked into the kitchen, opened the fridge, and stopped. There was no explanation this time. No way to talk around it. No performance strong enough to cover what was right there in front of everyone. The officer turned slowly. His expression no longer neutral. It wasn't anger. But it wasn't passive either. It was recognition. The kind that comes when something crosses a line that cannot be ignored. He asked a few more questions. Direct. Controlled. My son-in-law tried to respond. He tried to explain. Said he had been busy, that he hadn't gone shopping yet, that things had been difficult, that it wasn't what it looked like. The same tone. The same strategy. But this time, it didn't work. Because this time, there were witnesses. And then came the moment he wasn't prepared for. They asked about the child's routine. About meals. About supervision. About how often he was left alone. Simple questions. With answers that couldn't stay consistent for long. I watched as his confidence began to slip, slowly at first, then more visibly. The control he had held so carefully started to break. And for the first time since all of this began, he wasn't in control anymore. I stood there, watching everything unfold, not saying a word. I didn't need to. The truth was speaking for itself now. Not through emotion, not through accusation, but through reality. And as I looked at my grandson, I knew this was the moment everything changed. Not just for him, but for all of us. There are moments in life when everything becomes quiet, not because nothing is happening, but because something irreversible has just taken place. That's what it felt like standing in that living room, watching the officers speak calmly while everything my son-in-law had built began to fall apart piece by piece. There was no shouting, no dramatic scene, no chaos. Just truth. Settling into the room in a way that could no longer be ignored. One of the officers turned to me and asked a simple question. Is there a safe place for the child to stay? For a second I couldn't speak. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because hearing it out loud made everything final. It wasn't about suspicion anymore. It wasn't about doubt. It was about action. About removing him from that environment, from that silence, from that quiet hunger he had been living with while I believed he was protected. Yes, I said. My voice didn't shake. I'll take him. I walked over to my grandson, slowly, carefully, like I didn't want to overwhelm him. He stood up when he saw me coming. His small body tense in a way that told me he didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew something was changing. I knelt in front of him and looked into his eyes. The same eyes I had seen filled with hesitation just days before. We're going home, I said softly. For a moment he didn't move. Then quietly he nodded. That was it. No questions. No resistance. Just trust. And that broke something inside me in the most painful and beautiful way at the same time. Behind us, his father started talking again, louder now, more urgent. Trying to explain, trying to justify, trying to regain control over a situation that had already slipped out of his hands. But the tone had changed. The confidence was gone. What was left was desperation. And it was too late for that. The officers remained calm, firm, guiding the situation exactly as it needed to be handled. There was no space for manipulation anymore. No space for performance. Just consequences. I took my grandson's hand, and we walked out of that house together. The same house I had once believed was protecting him. The same house I had been helping sustain, without ever seeing what was really happening inside. But now, as we stepped outside, the air felt different. Lighter. Real. When we got into the car, he sat quietly beside me, looking out the window, holding on to something I had given him without even realizing it. 50. I started the engine, but before I drove away, I looked at him one more time. You won't be hungry again, I said. He didn't answer, but he leaned slightly closer. And that was enough. As I drove away, I didn't look back. Not at the house. Not at the past. Because some things, once revealed, don't deserve another glance. I thought losing my daughter was the worst thing that could ever happen to me. But I was wrong. The worst thing was almost losing her child while believing I was protecting him. Grief made me blind. Trust made me careless. But love, real love, forced me to see the truth when it mattered most. And if there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's that sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones you should watch the closest. Because silence doesn't always mean everything is okay. Sometimes means no one is listening. If this story moved you, if you believe no child should ever have to stay silent just to survive, take a moment to subscribe. Because stories like this happen more often than people realize. And sometimes, the only way to protect someone is to make sure their story is heard. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.